Officially existing for 50 years, with certain members existing for even longer than that, the Residents have led a long and partially mythological career. Their unique brand of surrealism has led to a highly devoted international fan base, including a number of highly respected celebrities. Each one of their albums includes a story or concept surrounding its creation, and it is perhaps best to tell the story of the Residents through the story of these albums. The story of the Residents, from the perspective it is probably best told from, starts in 1963 when an 18-year-old Hardy Winfred Fox enrolls in Louisiana Tech University. Here, Fox made a tight bond with a number of the more eccentric students, a number of whom may or may not have become the Residents. The tightness of this bond only increased as the years went by, and by 1969, they were all living together in a small apartment in San Mateo, California. Whilst living here, Fox developed an interest in amateur sound recording, and would work with California-based musicians James Whittaker and Bob Tagney, as well as a singer he had met in university. The four would record music together regularly, often pulling in anyone nearby to join. Soon, they figured they were good enough to compile a tape to submit to a major record label, their choice being Warner Bros. Records. Lacking any commercial potential, however, the tape was returned with a rejection slip, addressed to the Residents. Inspired by the uncaring language of the record industry, the group reformed as Residents Unincorporated, and shortly afterwards met with Philip Lithman and Ensenada, European musicians who had been inspired to collaborate with the group after hearing the tape.
I would like to say a few words about Ensenada, who is a wonderful, truly wonderful man who I met in the woods of Bavaria when I was on an expedition in Britain, my country. He worked with strange instruments that genuinely fascinated me. And he asked me to explain about his instruments. He worked with phonetic wood instruments which he made himself, and we translated his music into phonetics, and now we play music together with our group.
Sonata, an experienced musician in his 60s, took up a leadership position within the group, and wrote 8 tracks for their second audition tape to Warner Bros., which were again rejected. It was during the recording of this material that Philip Lithman adopted his eternal stage name of Snakefinger. Whilst reviewing photography of one of their private concerts, the group discovered a photo of Lithman playing violin. To his bandmates, the hand he used to hold the bow of the instrument resembled a snake's head, leading to his rechristening as Snakefinger. In mid-1972, Snakefinger left the group to return to England in order to pursue a career in pub rock, after which Residents Unincorporated purchased a studio space in San Francisco. Here, they began working on 2 projects, an EP titled Santa Dog, and a feature-length film titled Valness Fats. Santa Dog was released in December of 1972 on their Ralph Records label. Ensenada, meanwhile, had left the United States by February of 1973, after filming 2 scenes of Valness Fats. He traveled to the Antarctic in order to study the musical culture of the natives. When the group weren't at their day jobs, they were filming Valness Fats, and when they weren't filming Valness Fats, they were recording music. These recording sessions were largely based around practicing Ensenada's theory of phonetic organization, whereby an artist creates a song through the layering of textures rather than the construction of notes. As these recording sessions became more commonplace, a division between Residents Unincorporated began to form, comprising of those interested in recording music and those who were more interested in the group's other artistic pursuits. At some point in 1973, the subgroup began construction on a studio album, utilizing the material already recorded as a basis for it. This studio album would eventually become Meet the Residents. As the artist behind Meet the Beatles had been called the Beatles, the artist behind Meet the Residents would be called the Residents. Now, a subgroup with an official name needed to decide who its official members were. In accordance with Ensenada's theory of obscurity, which the group were devoted to, anyone within the group had to be anonymous. James Whittaker and Bob Tagney, who had appeared on a majority of the group's early recordings, were not residents, and were instead credited as guests on the 2 tracks they appeared on. Pamela Zybach, who had previously worked on Santa Dog anonymously, was here credited as a guest vocalist. But unlike Whittaker and Tagney, Zybach would continue to work with the Residents for a number of years after this. To promote the album, the group took out 2 print ads in File and Friday magazine, the former of which came with a flexi disc including 7 minutes of music from the album. Despite this, the album was largely ignored upon its release on April 1st, 1974.
Jay's just completed our income tax, and we've lost so much money with our business this year that we're getting a refund of over $3,000.
Meet the Residents is a masterpiece of cult-like, unpredictable noise. Its opening melody is a masterful cacophony of incomprehensible sound. It's got beautiful poetry, hilarious parody, and all runs at a breakneck speed so that you never find your footing. It is an album that is impossible to describe. It must be heard to be understood. It has tracks that are utterly beautiful and tracks that are genuinely terrifying. When people say this album sounds like nothing else, they really mean it. It was my first Resonance album that I heard, and it completely hooked me. I had no context for it at all. 5 years ago, Spotify's algorithm spat the opening track at me, and I've been obsessed ever since. The song was hilarious and dark and spooky and bad, but great at the same time. I had no idea what it was. It sounded like it was from a obscure tape made by a punk band in the 90s that just got put on Spotify recently, but it wasn't. It was from the 70s. After months of listening to the song obsessively, I discovered that it was from an album, and on that album there were songs that were even better. And thus, I was introduced to the beautiful world of Meet the Residents. The opening medley unfolded upon me out of nowhere. It was like being introduced to a whole nother world. The less you know about this album, the better. Part of its true charm is the utter mystery of it all, the mystery it creates surrounding even how it was constructed. It is for this reason that I don't listen to this album regularly. I put it away for some time after listening to it. It's important to me to hear it with fresh ears every time and not understand it too much. As their first album had been fated to obscurity, the Residents were burnt and decided to dedicate their second album entirely to obscurity. Ensenada's theory of obscurity, specifically. The group decided to focus on a practice within the theory of obscurity that had been explained to them by Ensenada. The practice involves creating a piece of art, in this case an album, to its point of completion. The artwork would then be shelved and only revisited once the artist had no recollection of the way it had been constructed, thereby experiencing the art with a fresh perspective, similar to the way the audience would experience it. Once the album had been completed in October of 1974, the group booked out 1 week's worth of vacation time from their day jobs in order to work on their follow-up to Meet the Residents. For this album, the group decided they were going to record 2 18-minute suites comprised of cover versions of top 40 hits released between 1954 and 1972. These covers were created by the Residents recording themselves playing along to the original record. The Residents would then remove the original recording from their final mix to reveal a strange new version. After this intense week of recording, the group left the material dormant for another 12 months, during which they maintained their day jobs, worked on wellness fats, and continued to hold their casual recording sessions, with no larger aim in mind. Then, in October of 1975, they revisited the material for another intense week of recording. After this, the album was completed, and they decided to focus on packaging. As the group's outrageous Beatles cover had refused to garner any attention, the Residents decided that for their second album, they needed to be even more outrageous. During one of their lunch breaks, the group's attention turned towards what they had been noticing about modern music. Whilst they all had modern music they enjoyed, they all thought that pop music, and those who presented pop music, had this sort of strange rock purist attitude, comparable to Hitler's attitude towards racial purity. The Residents felt they needed to say something about this, and since their material had been inspired by krautrock and was covers of classic pop songs, the group decided to theme their album around fascist imagery. Seemingly all agreeing to this batshit idea, the group erased Groovy Greats from their tape label of the material and replaced it with The Third Reich and Roll, and released it in February of 1976. Promotion of The Third Reich and Roll was more hands-on compared to that of Meet the Residents. The group performed their first ever live show, and also released a non-album single featuring a cover of I Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones. The group also began production on a music video for the first track of the album, Swastikas on Parade, but this video wouldn't be completed until after the release of their next album, Fingerprince. Despite all this effort, the group still failed to capture any critical attention, except for a negative review for their Satisfaction single in Trouser Press magazine.
I've read that Trouser Press magazine has referred to Satisfaction as the most determinedly repellent music ever heard. Can you comment on this?
I'll be glad to, Sid. I can certainly see the point of view for that contention. I think, however, the key word here is determinedly. One should question the purpose or intent of this work, and if they do, I'm sure that they will agree that this is, in fact, the most determinedly repellent music ever heard.
The Third Reich and Roll is a interesting Residents album, to say the least. Musically, it has everything you could ever want from a 1970s Residents release. It's strange, it's noisy, it's aggressive and counterculture, but at the same time, the fascist imagery that plagues the album hurts anyone's listening experience of it. Not to mention the fact that it provides a huge barrier for entry for any new fans who are any minority at all. The playfulness with which this imagery is used suggests a sort of detachment and misunderstanding of the true offensiveness of the imagery. This detachment is likely brought on by the group's only exposure to Nazi ideologies being through propaganda cartoons broadcast to them in the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s that sort of would have created this defanged version of a very real threat. And I imagine that the Residents thought that they were continuing this tradition of portraying the Nazis as weirdos and making fun of them by taking their image and twisting it, but it just comes off as offensive and hard to justify. As a queer and disabled person, the satire of the Third Reich and Roll is far from obvious and seems almost genuine the first time you hear about it. It put an uneasy feeling in my chest as I saw it after falling in love with Meet the Residents. In fact, I only actually listened to it because the spokesperson for the Residents came to me in a dream and told me to, which is really weird, but that's true. When I listened to it, I discovered that it wasn't about fascism at all, and it wasn't even racist if you listened to it. It was just a covers album, which confused but delighted me. I like the material on the album quite a lot. It's some of the Residents' most abrasive and counterculture music out there. It really sounds like you're being hit over the head. But this is still an album that I have a hard time talking about or defending, and part of me doesn't really want to defend it to people. It's a immature decision made by people during an immature time of an immature privilege. Bottom line, musically it's good, and if there was a different cover, I'd like it even more. The Residents have released several censored versions of the cover. I particularly am fond of the 1981 censored cover, which has all the stickers over it, but I've recently purchased the Cherry Red Records new censored cover, which came out in 2018, I believe.
Third Reich and Roll is a genius sprawling soundscape. The Residents successfully create a genuinely uneasy atmosphere that is entirely unmatched. Featuring early sampling technology utilized in a manner that creates an atmosphere that is reminiscent of a dementia patient's dying thoughts. But that's not the reason I love it. I love that the album, despite being unnerving, feels completely fun. The Residents seem to be having an incredible amount of fun while recording the album, which does make sense because for the Residents, it's not only making music, which I would assume they enjoy doing, but it's also them revisiting their childhood hits. This album, though, does have an elephant in the room. The marketing is unsavory and ultimately unnecessary. The use of Nazi imagery is unnecessary, and the album would be just as good without it. The fact that the album is good, even with its use of this imagery, still remains perfect is a testament to its quality. Third Reich and Roll is also arguably the Residents' most experimental release. With constant dissonance and its imagery in mind, it is the Residents' release most likely to push away newcomers. But with its sly sense of humor and genius concept, it easily pulls through as the Residents' best album, and also one of, if not the best album of all time.
In July of 1976, after the group's first live performance and the release of the third Reich and Roll, a number of the less musical members of Residents Unincorporated decided to negotiate with the Residents to become their managers. Homer Flynn, Jay Clem, John Kennedy, and Hardy Fox all formed into the management supergroup that is the Cryptic Corporation.
We here at Ralph Records and the Cryptic Corporation support the Residents in their point of view concerning the sorry state of affairs of this culture. We further feel that it's necessary to take certain supportive action to ensure that the Residents, as well as other artists like them, are able to exist and to function in this culture, which will in turn ensure that the culture has a future rather than having only a past.
Their first order of business was to cancel Varmless Facts. Despite the film being 70% complete, 4 years into production, it was seeming impossible to finish. They also purchased a larger studio space in San Francisco and also made defunct Residents Unincorporated. The Residents, meanwhile, were looking at their tape archives and looking at material they had written over the previous 3 years that was not appropriate for either the third Reich and Roll or the second album. The group took this material and started to reform it into their third album. Working with Zyback and Snakefinger, who had returned in time to perform at their first live show, the group constructed Fingerprince and Babyfingers, dual LP and EPs designed as mirrors of each other to be released concurrently. Fingerprince was famously pitched to the Cryptic Corporation as a 53-minute long free-sided LP, before being rejected and cut down to a two-sided LP that lasted 37 minutes. The remaining material, which made up the entirety of Babyfingers, was promoted as the missing third side to Fingerprince.
The Residents had recorded a three-sided LP to be released as such. Ralph Records disapproved this action due to the economic infeasibility, and a compromise was reached in which this extra material was pressed into an EP and is included with the Fingerprince Collector's Edition.
This was, of course, until 2018, when the Preserved Edition booklet for Fingerprince announced that this was in fact a prank played by the Residents on the Cryptic Corporation. According to these liner notes, the Residents always intended for Fingerprince and Babyfingers to be dual releases, with each track listing mirroring the other one. Knowing that their new money-conscious babysitters would refuse the idea of a dual release, they instead pitched it as a free-sided album, after which a dual release seemed like a nice compromise. Despite the 2018 liner notes supposedly telling us the truth about the conception of Fingerprints and Babyfingers, more recent writings on the album seem to use the original story, such as the 2022 book Faceless Forever and the 2023 liner notes for the Fingerprints reissue. So whatever the truth is, it seems to be another Residents mystery. Fingerprints was released in February of 1977 and was met with something the Residents had only dreamed of: critical acclaim. To promote this album, the Residents released another non-album single, this time featuring a collage of Beatles recordings on the A-side.
The Residents did record Flying, a Beatles tune from the Magical Mystery Tour album. You may be more interested to know, however, that the Beatles themselves perform a Residents song on the flip side of this very same record.
Aha! It must have been really tough to get those lads back in the studio again.
Tough it was, Sid. In fact, the Beatles don't even know they were there.
They also contributed a song to the Los Angeles Free Music Society's compilation album Blorpacet.
Whoopi Snorp is part of the album entitled Blorpacet, a production by the Los Angeles Free Music Society. The usage of this song was donated by the Cryptic Corporation to Lapham's for that purpose.
And as I understand it, this album contains quite a few selections, all performed by typical California idiots.
Yeah, well, Sid, possibly typical California idiots if you're a typical dumb Texas redneck bigot.
And produced a promotional cassette featuring an interview with head of marketing for Ralph Records, Jay Clem.
Look, at least they're doing
You just don't, if you don't have the scope to appreciate this thing, that's your hang up.
Well, now, wait a minute. Let's come on here now.
Yeah, you come on.
Why won't they sit down here and interview with us? Why won't they
They are more interested in the art than they are the personal exposure. They're not into this for glory, they're into it for the betterment of our culture.
The group also created a music video for Marzi Lawini using footage from Wagner's Fats. This video was most notably used as the introduction to their third rock and roll music video, which was released in December of 1977. Fingerprince is a great selection of tracks written by the Residents in what is essentially their golden age. Despite not having any coherent theming, the album has a strong, coherent sound that sounds unlike any other Residents album. The inclusion of Snakefinger adds so much to this album, and the whole thing feels like a jovial reunion. Tourniquet of Roses, specifically, is one of my favorite tracks by the group. It was briefly considered to be the title track of the album, and is amazing to see live. I saw the band all leave the stage, as over the speakers you could hear the final lines repeat over and over. But I have problems with Fingerprince as an album. Despite being a selection of great material by the group, structurally it feels a little bit half-baked and incohesive compared to other Residents albums. For any other band, this would be an amazing record with an amazing, strange, and cohesive sound, but for the Residents, it just feels a little aimless and like there's not much of a grander vision to it. By the time I'm halfway through the album and enjoying what I've heard, I realize that the second half of the album is on the way, and I lose interest significantly, because the second half of the album is entirely dedicated to one long percussion piece, and whilst this is fun to listen to a few times, eventually it just becomes boring and a reason to skip the album earlier. The CD releases of the album rearrange the track listing somewhat and include most of Babyfingers before the final half. Some people swear by this as the superior version. They say that the new tracks add a level of cohesion and make the album feel more rounded, but to me it just makes the album sound bloated. My ultimate thoughts on Fingerprince are that it is a great selection of songs by the Residents, but as an album listening experience it lacks the cohesion that I expect from a Residents album. I still recommend it to pretty much anyone, and say especially that if you've only heard Duckstep before this, to give it a shot.
Fingerprince is the album for me where the Residents really clicked. I had previously listened to Meet the Residents and Third Reich and Roll, which had their own interesting sort of recorded in a cave aesthetic, but it was Fingerprince where their studio techniques became more sophisticated and the use of a synthesizer and different instrument combinations and timbre that really interested me. And in that way, each song has this sound that doesn't sound like anything else. And it's something that's sort of a cliche when people talk about the Residents, or they'll say it sounds like nothing else, but it's really true because they basically fabricated their own aesthetic with unique processing of instruments and timbres, and they would combine these in ways that seem unintuitive or bizarre. But it creates this alien sound that really gets you thinking about how you take for granted the standard studio production for a rock band or a jazz band. That, you know, the Residents sound is so fabricated that it points out that other traditional studio sound for, let's say, I don't know, a conventional band like in the 70s, like I don't know, Black Sabbath, is just as fabricated in a way. And this really stands out on the opening track, You Yes Yes Yes, which pretty much lets you know you're not in Kansas anymore, with the combination of a drum machine just in the background with processed acoustic percussion, what sounds like distorted slide guitar being harmonized with itself, and these horns that are dissonant and they just don't fit, that go from stereo right to left, and this sort of bizarre mixture of doo-wop meets almost like film score chanting, and it's impossibly catchy. That song is such an earworm and a great opener for the album. And right after that, the next song, Home Age Conversation, it just sounds totally different with clanking piano and these thin processed vocals that go from ear to ear that are not in front of the piano at all, which is, you know, a big no-no. And you just have all these interesting things, and each song is like that, where it's like a left turn or a non sequitur from the next one, but it totally makes sense if you view the album as one big art project you listen to in a single sitting, and it's just great. And many of the other standouts for me is March de la Winnie with its percussion and processed woodwinds. Boohoo has this sort of tribal-esque primitive rhythms and doo-wop type vocals, which you would hear in Not Available, that was released later. And you just have all these things that start to make sense, that are catchy. Like, these could almost be pop songs if the lyrics were less abstract and the instrumentation was traditional rock band setup. But for me, the big piece de la resistance of this is Six Things to a Cycle, which was originally planned to be ballet music, which did not happen, and inspired by gamelan music of Indonesia. And it's something that I just love everything about it. I love the screeches and like the sort of fake jungle forest, like you're in King Kong type of sounds and shrieking, and then you get this cascade of different tinkling percussion. There's like stuff in there that sounds like steel drums or timbales with, I don't know if it's bells or glockenspiel or what it is, really, and you just hear this incessant pattern and rhythm that goes through the percussion to choo-choo, gum-choo, gum-gum, choo-choo, and then you have the synth sound, and it's really an exercise in variations, really. It's almost like a theme in variations you would hear in classical music. It's definitely not as strict or of a formal structure that classical music has, but you hear it varied upon, you know, like the moment at 10:40 where it's just synths playing a theme, and then the percussion comes back in, you have a choir, and at the end you have pizzicato and violin, and it's just like the theme and the entire mood of the song transforms from what instrument group is playing the melody. So it's really fascinating, and I vividly remember listening to this on my college campus and just being like totally taken away, where like I'm in another world. So it's a fantastic song. And the closer of the album, You Yes 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 Again, it feels like the end credits of like a spaghetti western or something. I'm not sure if it's an acoustic or electric guitar, but it's processed with like chorus or vibrato or something. And it's a really good bookend. I like how the album starts and ends with this song and the use of different instruments. Like there's chimes in there, or people may call them tubular bells, but they're chimes. And this album, like I said earlier, is really where the residents to me start to click a bit more, because their previous albums were more derived from jamming in the studio and then using tape editing techniques to construct something more coherent. And this album is the first one where we hear things closer to traditional songs. If you stretch the meaning of traditional, we have more standalone songs on this album that make sense. And you also have the beginning of the storytelling aspect of the residents. And this song doesn't really click to me. I know it's a fan favorite, but Walter Westinghouse sort of starts the sort of storytelling of the residents that would appear in later albums. And there's more lyrics with messages such as God's Song, talking about Christianity, which would be a theme returned upon in Wormwood. And it just feels like this is where we can more concretely hear ideas that appear throughout their career, is essentially what I'm saying. And the thing for me that stands out is, like what I said earlier, is that they have this totally unique aesthetic and sonic vision for their music that is done on purpose. This is done on purpose. There's no way how this album sounds was by accident. You know, this was something that they concretely wanted to make something totally unique. And it really got me thinking about studio production and how you approach visioning a sound differently, because, you know, traditionally you will, in Western music, one will write a composition on paper and it'll be for an instrument or what have you, right? You have the notes, you have the chords, you have the harmony, you have the melody and rhythms, and people sort of take for granted what instrument it is and what that instrument means, you know, through cultural cliches and musical cliches. That's really taken for granted for, and the residents don't take the timbre or instrument choice or combinations for granted, and it's very much done on purpose. And this is something where their studio technique and their use of different instruments show you can make something that's aesthetically and artistically compelling without having to have virtuosity as a musician or any of the flashy stuff of other bands. If it's having, you know, cute, attractive 20-year-olds with toothbrush smiles, or, you know, fancy graphics or shredding guitars, like, they don't have any of that, but it's all the more compelling because of what they do differently and why they do that differently.
Believing in him much better. I'm not sure.
As 1977 formed into 1978, the fan base of the Residents expanded massively, with thousands worldwide falling in love with the Residents' unique blend of art, music, and mythology. Throughout 1978, Ralph Records, now owned by the Cryptic Corporation, milked the Residents' newfound fan base, releasing a number of small but essential releases to the group's popularity, all the while promoting a new studio album which the group was struggling to produce.
Our longtime associate, the mysterious Ensenada, has been residing for some time at the North Pole and living with the Eskimos. Recently in the mail, the Inn sent to the Residents a cassette tape comprised of various audibles connected with various cultural festivities, which are a very integral part of the Eskimo culture. It is upon this very concept that the Residents have set about to do their next album.
And you mean to tell me that you actually believe this fabrication?
Sid.
The Residents had agreed to deliver the master tapes for this album in October of 1978, but instead silently left the country in apparent protest against Ralph's obsessive marketing techniques, which the group felt was harming their utilization of the fear of obscurity. Not having any album for their promised October 78 release date, which they had been promoting, the Cryptic Corporation instead rifled through the Residents' private tape archive and came across the master tape for their second album. They decided to release this as Not Available. Not Available was recorded during a period of great stress and uncertainty for the Residents, with the group coming to terms with the fact that their first album hadn't been a success, and some of them coming to terms with their sexuality. As a result, the group became irritable and formed a lot of drama around each other, which they decided to resolve by performing a piece of improvisational musical theatre, which eventually became the album. For this piece, the Residents all adopted personas reflecting their roles within the drama. They became the Catbird, the Enigmatic Foe, Porcupine, and Uncle Remus. Other non-residents involved included Edwina and Nobody. It was through the production of this material that the residents resolved a majority of their internal tension, and, once it was completed, they decided to adapt it into an album. But, for their own reasons, each resident suggested shelving the material, at least until the painful memories that had inspired the lyrics were forgotten. When this album was released in October of 1978, it was met with widespread critical acclaim, with praise going towards its instrumentation and emotional themes. Not Available is one of the greatest pieces of musical work of all time. It is a Rorschach's test of emotional themes. Its lyrics are so fanciful and complex that they become completely meaningless, except for a few words which the listener can relate to their own life. It's almost Shakespearean in this way. Even though the lyrics make it impossible to follow the plot, the delivery that the residents give these lyrics convey the raw emotion. I'd argue that Not Available has no plot and is simply an emotional roller coaster that you just have to strap into. Analyzing Not Available as a straightforward narrative is counterintuitive to experiencing it this way. I don't care who the catbird or porcupine are if you read the text, I just care that they're me and they're a reflection of my emotional struggles. In fact, I didn't realize until someone pointed it out that catbird and the porcupine are textually probably different characters, but to me, they've always been the same figure with different names. This ties into the theory of obscurity, with the work rewarding a degree of separation from artistic intent. At the same time, I feel like the narrative surrounding Not Available's release is a sort of farewell to the theory of obscurity. Ensenada states that an artist creates their most true and perhaps best work when shrouded within obscurity. This essentially means creating art without exposure to outside opinions that would influence your art. It also means that an audience's best appreciation of art comes with a lack of knowledge of the artist's background or intent. Within a group setting, such as how the residents used it, the theory of obscurity means crediting everyone's individual work under a single name, thereby deflating egos and creating a sort of unity to everything they do. Ensenada, outside of his brief work with the residents, worked under the theory of obscurity his entire life, and so little of his work is known because of this. But the residents, only 4 years into their career, were seemingly already losing faith in the theory. Even though the residents had asked the Crypto Corporation to provide the public with as false information as possible, an identity was still forming around them. An identity which, even hiding their names, could not prevent. And this in fact led to an audience who would interpret the work not based upon their own raw reactions, but instead to what they think the residents meant by this. By the mid-1980s, the residents were already requesting that the Crypto Corporation downplay the importance of the theory of obscurity on their work. And to me, Not Available is symbolic of them distancing themselves. The residents are upset at the Crypto Corporation for disrespecting the theory of obscurity. They leave. The Crypto Corporation disrespect the one album that we know was created with that in mind. The residents are fine with this and continue working with them afterwards. This to me absolutely represents a disregard of the theory of obscurity. Of course they continue to hide their identities, as they probably enjoyed the mono-identity and the lack of ego and the unity that gives to their work, but I think that this was the exact point when they realized that you can't be obscure and have an international fan base. If the residents were really devoted to the theory of obscurity, why would they release material at all?
What's up, everybody? It's your boy Sparky here. I'm just sitting on my toilet, eating my spaghetti, here to talk to you about my favorite Residents album, Not Available. Now, Not Available is an album, pardon my glasses, that I've been listening to over 24 years. 24 years! And I still have no fucking clue what that album is about. But maybe, I don't know, a year ago, it hit me. The album does make sense. And that's what's so beautiful about it, is that it's just about sounding good. And the singing resident, he just went in and made words that are beautiful. And they don't make no sense. But when put together, those words make gorgeous sounds. Now, another thing that got me really into Not Available is the fact that the accordion in Never Known Questions is the song that made me fall in love with the accordion. Now, I also stand by the fact that the accordion can sound like a bunch of cats being beat to death with a violin, but it also has the ability to be beautiful. Also, I never heard the name Edwina before, and I thought they were saying Aunt Weena. Wieners. Anyway, also Not Available, it's so diverse. From song to song, it sounds totally different because each song's got like 4 songs built into it. And that drum machine, oh, I love it. It's got a little samba sound to it. The whole thing is beautiful. And I think Not Available might be the best album ever made. Alright, Sparky here, signing off from my toilet with my spaghetti.
When the residents eventually returned to San Francisco, they discovered that the Crypto Corporation, as an apology, completely upgraded their recording setup. Overjoyous at this, the residents immediately began work on a contractually obligated EP. Since it was known early on that Eskimo would take literal years to complete, the residents and Ralph Records came to an agreement that they would release 2 EPs in 1978 in order to maintain an audience during the heft of the album's production. The first of these EPs, Duckstab, was released in February and was met to widespread critical and commercial acclaim, and is perhaps still to this day the Residents' most commercially successful release. On Duckstab, the Residents present a more digestible version of the style they had developed on Fingerprince. They boast pop structures and a new confident vocal style which, when added with the fact that the lyrics were pasted on the back of the sleeve, highlights their masterful use of absurd poetry. And so now it was time to complete a follow-up. They took some outtakes from the first EP sessions, wrote some new songs, and continued working closely with Snakefinger to produce Buster and Glenn. Despite the success that the Duckstab EP had brought Ralph and the Residents, they were both unhappy with one thing. Because the EP had been released on a 7-inch 33 RPM disc, it had an inferior sound quality, which gave a bad impression to new listeners. As a result, they did not want to repeat that same mistake, and so agreed to combine the 2 sets of material, Duckstab and Buster and Glenn, into one new LP. A new album, released only a month after Not Available, would be easier to market than an EP. The album was released as Duckstab, Buster and Glenn, but this title was later simplified to just Duckstab when it was released on CD in the late 1980s. This is the title that most people are probably familiar with. Most reissues of the material feature the shortened title, although recent reissues by Cherry Red Records have used the full one. Duckstab. Oh my god, Duckstab. Duckstab is like a masterpiece of everything residential. This is most people's favorite Residents album, and for good reason. It's like a perfect storm of 1,000 great ideas coming together at once, a real lightning in a bottle situation. It's dark, it's funny, and all over art. Comparing it to anything else is inappropriate. Even its direct predecessor, Fingerprince, sounds nothing like it. The appeal of Duckstab is impossible to describe. Why does it sound like that? Why does it do these things to me when I listen to it? I don't understand it. Every time I listen, I try to dissect another part of it to understand exactly why I think this is the perfect album. The wood percussion instruments, the persistent bass synth, the flange that's on everything, the vocal style, Snakefinger's string instruments, and the Lewis Carroll-esque lyrics, they all just add together to make this perfect little piece of music. It's structured perfectly. Every song is its own world. Mwah! Listening to this album, it's immediately obvious how it could inspire so many people like Primus and Ronaldo on the Loaf. It's just perfect. Structurally, it's perfect and never lets up, either on a 2-sided vinyl or a one straight-through listening experience. It's just great, with its fast, danceable, crazy, weird beats. Each song is so dense and textured with strange things that I started noticing things about it today when I was listening it to prepare for this segment. Oh, and the cover, man, that black and red cover, it's just perfect. It jumps right out at you and tells you to listen to the album right now. It's so intriguing. Everything from the knife he's holding, the duck, or the expression on his face. How did he make that expression? It's just perfect. It symbolizes everything about early Residents. Darkstab isn't even my favorite album by the group, but I understand how great it is. And this, of course, isn't to say that if you don't like Darkstab, you won't like the Residents, because that's absolutely not true. I know many Residents fans who hate Darkstab because they have that diverse a catalogue. I like Darkstab a lot.
Darkstab / Buster and Glenn goes into sonic and songwriting territory that is still sorely underrepresented in the majority of music. Even after dozens of listens, I still can't figure out if it's intentional or not. There's a few factors at play here. First off is the Residents' attitude towards sound design, brought about by curious exploration, as well as the Residents' own trademark DIY philosophy. This is one of the most sonically adventurous albums I've ever heard, down to the disgusting, nauseating detail. Listen to how equalizers are pushed to the mind-numbing extreme. The dizzying layers of panning, those perfect distortions brought about through intentionally applied effects, and possibly unintentionally the quirks of their homegrown recording process. There's a real sensation that the Res aren't just aware of their own limitations. They are bouncing around inside them with glee and are keen to wring every last possible auditory drop from their ramshackle setup. The aforementioned DIY philosophy also extends to the Residents' songwriting panache. The flowery lyrics are chosen purposefully for the bouncy, playful cadence present throughout the album. As a result, the colouring escapes the outlines. The actual narrative intention behind a lot of these songs is quite blurred, but between the descriptors in the lyrics and the bizarre, overpowering production, each track mentally paints its own strange, usually disturbing story. Sometimes the tone isn't dictated by the lyrics. Nothing that sinister happens in the lyrics of Hello Skinny, but the song is so uncanny and disturbing, we know we can't trust this skinny fella whatsoever. From what I've been able to tell, the Res wanted to make an album that would appeal to the youths at the time, and probably make a bit of money for once. Any other band would make a pop album, but this album is like a photo negative of pop music. Between how choked the audio quality is compared to everything else from the time, and the unabashedly weird prose-first songwriting, it feels like there's a focus on inciting every emotion a human could possibly feel, including irritation, fear, apprehension, disgust. Except maybe the nice emotions. Why not? If you're looking for those normal emotions, you should consider a normal pop album.
And like I say, simply it just means the organization of sound. More generally, it means that a musician or a recording artist, whatever, need not necessarily follow the established rules of music. Theoretically, you can take any group of sounds and organize them in an interesting manner, and this is what the residents try to do. There's a certain basic primitive quality to all the residents' work. They rely more on the primal instincts. Percussion and basic beat is a rudimentary concept involved in earlier forms of music. The residents' work of art is indeed the record itself, and the creative process is done in the studio. The main instruments used are in fact the studio and its various components. It's hard to say that this is music or art for the future, but obviously it's not for the future because it happened yesterday. So it's for now, or in fact it's old, because by the time somebody's heard it, it's already been done. But in a relative sense, if indeed the mass populace is here, then the residents are in the future.
According to the 1992 book Uncle Willie's Highly Opinionated Guide to the Residents came up with the idea for the Eskimo album in April of 1976. The group were walking around San Francisco and discussing what to do now that the punk style they'd been working in for some years at that point was beginning to bore them. Then they saw a billboard containing Santa Claus holding a can of Coke. They saw this sign as a sign and decided to make their next album inspired by Inuit culture. They immediately rushed to the library to see what they could find on the subject. Although they found very little, the little they did find set their imaginations alight. At the same time, the residents were experimenting with their new 16-track recording studio and wanted to see how it could not just make songs, but advanced and detailed soundscapes. It was then decided that the residents' next album would be comprised entirely of these, all based around a fictionalized version of Inuit culture.
If you've listened to Eskimo, yes, it's practically not music at all. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's an absolute masterpiece and maybe one of the most important records of the decade. I would say without doubt it is. Really, it's completely different and it's yet to be classified as anything in particular.
The album features subtle messaging about the Western world's ignorance to other cultures, and also comments on how globalized capitalism reduces cultural identity. The residents began enthusiastically working on the project as soon as they could. Then, they hit a slump and finished it 4 years later with the assistance of Snakefinger, Chris Cutler, and Mothers of Invention keyboard player Don Preston. When the album was released in October of 1979, it immediately became iconic, with the imagery of the cover becoming the residents' most recognized image. For the cover, the residents commissioned the construction of 4 eyeball helmets to be worn during the shoot. This image, so iconic and striking, immediately became synonymous with the residents. Sales-wise, the album sold better than anything else Ralph had ever put out. It also became a critical darling, shaking up the music press, with many already doubting the residents' ability to follow it up. Okay, how do I talk about this album? This album, which is probably my favorite Residents album. An album that's received so much praise that I don't know if I'd be saying anything that hasn't been said before. As I'm sure you've noticed, a common theme and element of the Residents' early work is material which is offensive or has aged poorly. And this album, which I love, which is a captivating soundscape with amazing production and stimulating sounds, is no exception. Its title, an exonym for the Inuit and Yupik people, is in the modern age, and perhaps has always been, considered a derogatory term for those people. Etymologists are divided as to what the original meaning of the phrase was, but modern Inuit and Yupik people do not condone its use. The album, which is a imitation of their culture by people who admittedly know very little about it, is very easily seen as offensive towards these people. The album's audio content combines fantastical sounds with basic musical content to create a narrative which is both vivid yet unique to the listener's imagination. But the packaging of the album is a sarcastic comment on the white man's ignorance towards any other culture. culture. The liner notes explain in detail how each track relates to circumpolar life, except it's all nonsense. It's all highly ridiculous nonsense that is meant to make the reader think to themselves, hey, wait a minute, I actually don't know a lot about circumpolar life. And this is what the eyeballs are meant to represent, at least in this case. They're looking at you, the presumed Westerner, and suggesting that you do some looking inwards at yourself too. This, like the Third Reich and Roll, falls far too neatly into the concept of ironic racism, an idea which is far less progressive than the residents probably thought. But like the Third Reich and Roll, this is an album where, if you weren't aware of the title, you wouldn't even think of Inuit or Yupik people. Like Not Available, the sounds are vague but evocative enough to create an image in your mind based on your interpretation of the sounds. I've run blind tests where I've played people this album with no context, and they have come up with answers that it's about cavemen or aliens or something like that, proving that the only reason your mind jumps to Inuit cultures when you listen to the album is because of the title. However, they still did imitate a culture that they knew nothing about. This is, in my opinion, the album's only flaw. Without that concept attached, this album is just a 40-minute, amazing and stimulating soundscape set in an intriguing and fascinating world. Like with Duckstab, there's something truly indescribable about what makes this album appealing. It isn't musical in almost any sense, except for when the subjects are playing music. It is the ultimate expression of Ensenada's theory of phonetic organization, because it's just a series of interesting and stimulating sounds building up on each other until it creates an environment and narrative. It lies somewhere neatly between electronic music, musique concrète, and soundscapes to create something that is entirely different from anything else you'll hear from any other band. The fact that it's so unmusical is a concept that some fans find hard to get around, but to me, that just makes it all the better. It's like a literal tickle to the eardrum as you hear these strange and fascinating noises. For the album's 40th anniversary, the Residents released a special edition of it, which features all the elements they recorded, presented, separated from one another. And the liner notes suggest that you, the listener, should create your own version of the album using these elements. This is such a cool concept, and it's how I finally understood the theory of phonetic organization. Don't let the unmusical nature of the album distract you from the fact that it has some serious bangers on it. The opening and closing tracks of the album feature the subjects performing some music. The Walrus Hunt is eerie and intriguing and iconic in its own right, and the Festival of Death is a straight up banger, man. It goes hard. They even played this as the encore to their 13th anniversary show. It's just great that way. And there's even audio of the Residents jamming on the track in 1982. The Walrus Hunt, meanwhile, went on to form the basis of one of the Residents' great tracks, Eskimo, a disco remix of the entire album, which is still performed live by the group to this day and is a banger whenever you listen to it. And the less musical middle tracks are best to be listened to be understood. My ultimate opinion on the album is that it is a sonic masterpiece, but the attempts to make it political and make it about racism and xenophobia do more harm than good. I said earlier that you could ignore the concept, but even then it is still an exploration of the perhaps racist trope of the primitive. Despite all that, I still think this is one of the most essential Residents listening experiences, and I think that you should listen to it if you listen to any Residents album at all.
I listen to music mostly for the sonics. If it's something that I can kind of get latched onto, that's guaranteed, like, replayability for myself. And is an interesting case, because I am hard-pressed to call it a musical album, more like an album of soundscapes. It's like a sonic palate cleanser. It's easy to get immersed and kind of lost in the story, the narrative that the residents are portraying with this soundscape. And I think that's why it has to be my favorite. You know, all of the residents have never really put out a bad album, but it was just something else.
We have hit most of the four corners of the earth, and there are a handful of people in all those four corners that are, know and understand us, but every day it's a new and opening field for us just to bring this music and to make people understand it. There's something besides Bruce Springsteen and Led Zeppelin to listen to.
We're one of the few independents that seems to have managed to last for 10 years. Not very many of them that can seem to stay in business for 10 years. I think we've been able to because we offer an alternative product. We're not really competing with the majors. We don't put out their type of product. We're booming. We're bigger than ever.
The residents had finally done it. They had quit their day jobs, made a soundscape album their bestseller, and had impressed every music critic this side of New Wave. Now, bona fide pop stars, the residents began perfecting their craft. As the group had spent the past 4 years working on Eskimo, a large amount of their pop material had gone to waste. The stuff that couldn't appear on Fingerprince, Baby Fingers, Subterranean Modern, Chewing Hides the Sound, Duck Stab, or Buster and Glenn ended up in what was essentially their waste bin. It was through the construction of this material and a painstaking dissection of the top 40 that the residents discovered that most pop songs featured only about 1 minute worth of songwriting, just repeated 3 times. The residents realized that by cutting the fat of this material, they could create their own personal top 40 record, with minutes to spare. It was through this concept that the residents birthed their commercial album, which was designed to flex their skills as songwriters, editors, and prove the vacancy of pop songs by doing more in 1 minute than most pop stars could do with 3. To complete the album, the residents continued their long-standing working relationship with Snakefinger, Chris Cutler, and Don Jakovic. They also hired a number of celebrity guests to appear on the album, but I won't tell you who they are. I will note, however, that this album marks the introduction of collaborator Nessie Lessons, who worked with the residents both credited and anonymously until 1985. She even toured with them briefly. To promote the album, the residents directed 2 music videos based on songs from the album, and hired friend of the group, Graham Whiffler, to direct 2 more. These were compiled into 1-minute movies, a short film which earned the residents some notoriety in the early days of MTV.
To many people, that's the only thing visually that they see. They've heard the music, and I kind of supply part of the fantasy. There's a lot of dream symbolism that we use in our films, and that's fairly obscure as a dream can be. This is the film camera we use, which is a lot different than your video cameras, because this is a tough little son of a gun, because we can drive nails. And I dare you to do that with your old video camera. Getting your interest up and then not coming through, teasing people is a large part of what we do. I like to give them something really interesting that they really want to know more about, and then we say, next week, fella. You know, it's a tease, constant tease. People feel something after they see our videos. Feel sick. Yeah.
Ralph Records, meanwhile, promoted the album by purchasing 40 advert slots on a top 40 radio station, during which a single song from the album would play. The commercial album, 40 one-minute songs by everyone's favorite musical weirdos, showcasing everything the residents had learned in their collective 11 years of musicianship. You'd think that for an album with 40 songs, some songs would be lesser than others or feel out of place, but that's not the case for the commercial album. The commercial album has this strange cohesion to it that makes it a perfect listening experience. and the length of the songs mean that you rarely get bored. If you decide you don't like one song, you've only got a minute to wait before the next one starts, which you might like a lot more. It's also the most varied of any Residents album, with more guest vocalists than any other, all of whom bring their own unique flavour to the tracks. The song's lyrics are almost structured like jokes. For example, on Moisture we have this setup of a crime scene in which a body has been found covered in slime, and the punchline is that a snail did it. Ups and Downs, for example, has this amazing setup about this mysterious lady in an elevator. The man asks, "Can I get on the elevator?" And the punchline is that she says no and just leaves. The instrumentals also don't feel like filler tracks, they feel like complete cohesive things. Instrumentally, you can definitely feel how this album, more than others, was made using the theory of phonetic organization. You can almost feel how everything was built up and almost detect the order in which it was. A aspect of the commercial album that isn't mentioned nearly half as much as it should be is the unique and cool bass playing that is throughout the album. It adds a sort of live feeling to the songs that other Residents material doesn't. According to Spotify statistics, the commercial album is probably the Residents' most popular release. But I found that during the production of this video, I've somehow neglected it. I've sort of avoided listening to it, and I don't know really why. Perhaps I've overplayed it? Or it's perhaps the fact that it's 40 tracks is daunting. Now, it shouldn't be daunting to listen to these 40 tracks, because they're all 1 minute long, and the album as a whole is 40 minutes long, so it doesn't really make sense. But I don't want to rag on the commercial album, like, at all, because obviously it's beloved, it's great, it's a masterpiece. I just had a weird experience with it this time, but it's definitely worth listening to. My favourite tracks on the album include Margaret Freeman, The Coming of the Crow, Loss of Innocence, Medicine Man, and many others. I also want to give a shout out to the commercial DVD, a 2004 project orchestrated by the Residents, where a bunch of different creators, including the Residents, created short films to go with each of the songs from the album. I highly recommend that you don't check out the YouTube rep, because the quality on that thing is awful and out of sync, so it'll give you a bad impression of the actual DVD. I recommend seeking it out, partly because it's called the commercial DVD for a reason, because the interactive menu is a very big part of that release. Being 40 tracks long, the commercial album is highly varied, and this makes it somewhat hard to form a cohesive review around, despite the fact that the album has a highly cohesive sound. So forgive me for sort of not being as clear with what this is as I have been in the other reviews. It's not difficult to write a 1 minute long song. In fact, that's usually just the first quarter of the songwriting process. But what is difficult is making that 1 minute sound completely developed and satisfying to listen to. And the Residents do that 40 times, just proving how great a songwriting team they had become at this point, and will continue to be from this point onwards.
Commercial Album was the first Residents album I heard, and it remains my favorite. I saw the video, The Act of Being Polite, on MTV, and immediately ran to the store and bought the CD. The band's sense of melody is in peak form, and the arrangements are among their most accessible. The lyrics are perfect little distillations of pop music tropes, mostly about love or the lack thereof. But my favorite feature of the album is the way it somehow dilates time. So much happens in the space of 60 seconds, each song opening up into a world of its own. They don't feel incomplete or too short, they're just right. And the fact that a collection of 40 one-minute songs never becomes annoying or tedious is nothing short of miraculous.
Yeah, so one of my favorite Residents albums is the commercial album. It was one of the first I had picked up. I had found it at a used record store Didn't really know what I was getting into. Just knew The Residents was a band that I needed to check out, and was absolutely blown away by how conceptual it was. Not only was the music really interesting and engaging, but I really loved how it was a commentary on top 40 radio, and essentially how like most pop music is just jingles, and they really distilled that concept down and made something incredibly unique with it.
I would also be doing a disservice to the record if I didn't talk about the art. I thought it was equally brilliant that they featured John Travolta and Barbra Streisand on the cover, two people that were pretty huge in pop culture at the time. And then even on the back, how they created their own top 40 chart, and then even took it one step further by playing the record on KFRC in full, I think over the course of, I believe, 3 days.
There are always people that are against change, and there are always people, I mean, like Ralph Records has a lot of, I mean, I guess you'd say enemies, that they realize that we're a threat to the mainstream of rock. And we are a threat. I'm jolly pleased to be a threat. That's the only way I'd want to be. We're a threat to mainstream rock and roll, therefore mainstream rock and roll stations won't play us. They, avoid us, and basically, I'm not saying that there's aliens out there plotting against us. I don't have paranoid fears of anything like that. But I know, just through logic, that people try and avoid us, and they try and hold us back, not through any sort of evil in themselves, just for their own safeguards, basically. And just explaining that it's time for something new. No, it's not out there on its own. No, it's not completely thoughtless noise. There is substance to it, and if you listen to it a few times, you'll start to understand what's going on.
The commercial album had been a financial success for The Residents and Ralph Records, but the vulture-like critics had decided that The Residents' jokes were no longer funny. The Residents were seemingly so far away from Ensenada's teachings at this point that they not only read these reviews, but got worked up about them. Enraged, The Residents decided to channel this anger into their work, and decided that their next studio album would be noisy, ugly, angry, and most importantly, contain nothing even remotely resembling a joke. Their 8th studio album, Mark of the Mole, would be a gritty tale about natural disasters, immigration, exploitation, and racism. The album would be the first in the group's history to feature no credited guests. Their regular team of session musicians, including Chris Cutler, Don Jakovic, and Snakefinger, were nowhere to be seen. Snakefinger, in particular, was taking something of a break from working with The Residents. This was in order to focus on developing material with his new backing band, the Vestal Virgins, which notably featured Eric Drew Feldman of the Magic Band. A narrative concept album, the storyline focuses on a race of anthropomorphic moles as they deal with the destruction of their homeland. They travel to a new land where their labor is exploited by the land's people, which results ultimately in a full-out civil war that begins as the album concludes. As they developed the story, the world of the moles expanded in the Residents' mind, and they all agreed that it was impossible to tell their full story in only one album. And so, they decided they would do it across 3 albums, each detailing another generation of mole kind. The Residents decided that Mark of the Mole would be their first multimedia project, spanning the next 4 years of their career. They were proving the claims that they were not just a band, but were in fact an entire art collective.
I think they're more than a band. The Residents have an ability to communicate with the world, to produce art, if you want to call it, that appeals to many people, appalls the rest. But I believe it is creditable, and if only it serves our professors of history in the future, their work is valuable.
Mark of the Mole is a poignant and aggressive amazing narrative album that plays on themes of racism, migration, exploitation, cultural misunderstanding, white saviorism, religion, passion, greed. It is an album that is handled so well. Mark of the Mole's sound is so perfected that it makes the commercial album sound like a test run for this. Everything adventurous about the commercial album is done tenfold here. And every note feels dramatic and important. Over the course of the 40 minutes, you really connect with the creatures who struggle for their safety in life, all thanks to the great performance and musicianship, as well as great words. Some argue that this is where the Residents lost their lyrical spark, with the fanciful yet vague lyrics of the earlier albums absent. But I'd argue that this works only in the album's favour, highlighting the seriousness and bluntness of the subject matter. The Chubbs' exploitation and phobia towards the moles creates an obvious parallel to the specifically southern bigotry that the Residents would have grown up around. The Cryptic Corporation have often stated that the Residents wrote Mark of the Mole to be a sort of metaphor for their own struggles, whereby a disaster causes the Residents to flee into the music business, where they are exploited. But many Mark of the Mole fans think that this interpretation leads to a more shallow view of the album, and that it's much more powerful if you just view it as a straightforward parable for immigration and racism and xenophobia. Mark of the Mole is the Residents at the peak of their ability, proven by the lengthy suites, which, in spite of their length, are constantly engaging. Mark of the Mole has a definitive, harsh and noisy sound, but unlike the third Reich and Roll, which is in many ways unfiltered noise and genuinely bad playing, Mark of the Mole has intent, and each note aids the emotional resonance of the piece.
Mark of the Mole's industrial, harsh noise style mixed in with a powerful story about survival and fighting on for a better tomorrow stands as my favorite Residents album and my favorite project as a whole. Even if it initially started as the band trying to break out into the mainstream as they rose from the underground, it ended up having a life of its own as an allegory for a refugee crisis, but to me as a Mexican-American fan, it especially reminds me of Americans' treatment of the Latino-Hispanic community. Traveling to a new promised land looking for a better life where the citizens immediately take advantage of you, using you to do jobs no one else could care to do, and being paid poorly and getting turned down once you ask for a better livable wage, only to later have said citizens demonize you for having too many of you and trying to drive you away. This is very much true in the real world, happening still even now. Another noteworthy thing this story tells, the Mole trilogy is written in a way in where any oppressed group can resonate with it. Many other fans' interpretations see it in multiple different ways, which is a testament to how much it blankets everything. Virtually anyone can see themselves in it in some capacity. The Big Bubble is no exception. It especially reminds me of being a person of color born in America. Being born of multiple generations, I can't resonate with my grand family members from long ago, so I couldn't get the full experience of my own heritage very much. And when you do, it's very watered down, or you're told you didn't grow up in X, so why should you care? And in this album, the few who remember the ancient language of Mohammed don't fully recall or even know how to pronounce it anymore, what with it being banned in Chubbsville. The new generation of Cross don't even know their original roots at this point. The Big Bubble is a heartbreaking tale of how colonization of multiple generations strip you away from what makes you what you are. A garage band the album is named after, made up of Cross members that cared enough to cry out for what happened to their ancestors long ago, to never stop fighting, to never forget who you are.
In 1981, around June, Emu's Emulator was released. The Emulator was one of the first keyboards with sampling capabilities, and it was definitely the first that was within the Residents' price range. It was seemingly obvious that this keyboard was going to be a game changer, and so the residents, acting quickly, purchased the 5th system ever produced. They received it during the mixing stages for Mark of the Mole, and it became an immediate obsession for the group. After a few months of toying with the instrument, the residents officially declared that their era of the synthesizer was over. The possibilities of this equipment seemed endless, and the residents based their 10th studio album, The Tunes of Two Cities, entirely around it. Within the fiction of the Mole trilogy, The Tunes of Two Cities is a compilation of songs made and enjoyed by moles, and songs made and enjoyed by chubs. The chubs material utilizes the emulator's ability to sample instruments that the residents were otherwise unable to play, such as brass instruments. And the moles material utilizes the emulator's ability to sample non-musical sounds, such as a washing machine or some shit like that. These emulators, more importantly, allowed the residents to seriously contemplate touring, which is something that Ralph had been pushing them towards doing for 4 years at that point.
They'll be using emulators, which are digital computers. Basically, you can take anything that they've done in the studio, which could never be reproduced, and now reproduce it while actually playing on the keyboard. In other words, it's sort of like I hate to say an advanced mellotron or something, but it's just because they play all these stupid instruments, these little cardboard boxes and things, and you really can't do that live, but now they can reproduce that without using any tapes.
After some tentative rehearsals, the residents ultimately decided that the material found on Mark of the Mole was a lot easier to replicate live than any of their other material. The residents then began construction on The Mole Show, a theatrical adaptation of Mark of the Mole with a few Tunes of Two Cities songs thrown in there, designed to be toured across California in Halloween of 1982.
It's going to be more of a theatrical presentation. There are going to be dancers involved in the show, there'll be actors involved in it, there'll be backdrops, there are 20 completely painted backdrops involved in the show, there'll be a lot of props. Just the whole thing is just to make it more visual and hopefully more entertaining.
Ralph was in some financial trouble at the time, and the critical and commercial reaction to the Tunes of Two Cities had been disappointing at best. But a tour was bound to fix any problems that Ralph was having.
We don't really need such big numbers to survive. Unfortunately, recently, the numbers that we have been getting haven't been quite as big as they used to be. And those numbers were adequate for us to survive. And to a great extent, we're putting a lot on this residence tour in order to keep things going.
We are putting everything behind this, and it's that important to us. And that's really the only way it could be done. And I guess if it just doesn't work, well, then we'll reorganize. I think we'll continue to exist, but perhaps in a different form, and it may take us a few years to get back up again. But that doesn't stop us.
We just lost too much money on certain acts where we couldn't recoup our money enough to do the next project on down the line.
Ralph is doing this by choice. If there's a financial effect, it's just the other way around. It's not the financial effects that are forcing it to happen, but the financial effects that might be forceful on the effort.
It's gotten so confusing. It's all gotten out of hand. We had to borrow money from our parents to finish the show. It takes 3 weeks for a check from Louisiana to clear the bags.
The economic recession had forced Ralph to drop all of their artists except for 3. The Residents, Fred Frith, and Ronaldo and the Loaf, all of whom were self-financing in many ways. Although the reasons aren't completely known, it is perhaps due to this economic recession that Jay Clem retired from Ralph Records. He was by far the hippest person the Residents knew, and was the only person at Ralph who really had his finger on the pulse of what the music industry was interested in. As a result, the Residents had a hard time marketing themselves after this. Although Jay has never given a clear reason as to why he left Ralph Records, he had negotiated with the label to obtain the rights to Yellow. Yellow were a synth-pop duo who had been signed to Ralph for their first 2 albums. They later went on to have numerous chart successes in Europe, most notably Oh Yeah. It has been suspected by the likes of Ian Shirley that Clem had intended to become the manager of Yellow full-time, as they had shown the most commercial potential of any ex signed to Ralph. But there's no evidence of Clem having ever been Yellow's manager, and he quickly sold the rights before retiring from the music industry altogether. The Tunes of Two Cities is, in many ways, the ultimate test for Residence fans. It is what separates the Cliffords from the rest. It is somehow both their most uncompromising release, and also features some of their most accessible compositions. The Tunes of Two Cities isn't here to make new fans of the Residents at all. By marketing it as part 2 of Mark of the Mole, the Residents are effectively stamping their feet in the ground and protesting any new audience attempted. Which might have been the wrong move, given the financial troubles that Ralph Records were about to find themselves in. Devoting an entire album to one instrument feels like the product of extreme tunnel vision, and the album ends up sounding more like a tech demo rather than a coherent album. But the Tunes of Two Cities holds a special place in my heart. Because the Chubs' easy listening parody music is so accessible, it's some of the easiest material to get people into the band through. And songs like Smack Your Lips have become favourites among my more casual Residents friends. The Residents' early material has a sort of instant gratification to it, but as they go on to tackle more complicated ideas and themes, you end up more often having to meet the Residents halfway. The Tunes of Two Cities was initially an album that bounced off me the same way it does for many other fans of the group. But upon multiple re-listens, I discovered that the album was a great dance album. I suppose this is why the Tunes of Two Cities segments of the Mole Show heavily feature interpretive dances, sort of to give example to the audience. I find personally that when I'm listening to the album whilst performing my own interpretive dances, my enjoyment of it increases tenfold. When you take into account the supposed metaphor that Mark of the Mole is about the Residents' relationship with the music industry, the Tunes of Two Cities sort of represents the Residents showcasing the two paths they could take, or perhaps the fact that they could take both of them at once. On one half, you have the Residents siding with the mainstream Chubs, producing genuine, easy-listening, commercial, sellable music. And on the other half, you have the Residents performing with the Moles, creating this harsh, avant-garde, experimental music that is harsh to listen to even for Residents fans. But at the same time, they're showing you both on the same record, showcasing that they can do both. They can appease the commercial market, and they can appease the more weird fans. The album features amazing and subtle world building for the Moles and Chubs. In the obvious sense, we hear the different music of the two cultures, but in a less obvious sense, we see the titles, which are largely nonsense to us as humans, but to Moles and Chubs are presumably important elements of their culture. This was largely the basis of the Mark of the Mole comic book, which the Cryptic Corporation licensed in 1982. The comic, written and drawn by Matt Howarth, is a sci-fi comedy and makes sense of the strange titles that are shown in The Tunes of Two Cities. The comic is set a generation or so after the events of Mark of the Mole, and is worth the price of admission alone for the cool designs that are featured within. Another very cool and very subtle piece of world building that the album does is the inclusion of the original Mahomet language, which is the language that the Moles themselves speak. It is hidden in the mix of every other track on the album, and is a cool little Easter egg if you listen out for it. Personally, I feel like The Tunes of Two Cities is a very rewarding listen to those who are willing to give it time. Unfortunately, not many are.
In Tunes of Two Cities, the Residents, maintaining their childish spirit alive, treat every fancy new instrument as their latest toy, doing all sorts of things with them to see what they were capable of. Albums like Limbo had demonstrated that they could create entire worlds out of these playful sessions of tape manipulation. The emulator, however, streamlined this process in a way that made the recording sessions faster and more fruitful. It has been said by others before that this is the continuation of the documentary approach first seen on Eskimo. In that album, the catchy melodies and hooks from projects like Meet the Residents or Dogstep were sacrificed to make room for an immersive atmosphere. That's understandable, the goal of the project demanded an approach like that, but to me, Eskimo lacks a bit of that playful spirit that I enjoy from the band. Tunes manages to combine both of these working methods, to document and to amuse. With the Shops, they create a very hummable collection of songs, easygoing tracks that will make you tap your foot and whistle with speed whenever you think about them. While with the Moles, they create impenetrable chants, esoteric tribal music that is not meant to be listened with joy, but with solemnity. That is not to say these goals are mutually exclusive. On the contrary, mole tracks are really charming once you get past their somber tone. The muddy laments of the mole workers hide the soul of their culture. To the mole, happiness is working. To fulfill a useful role for your own society is dignifying, pleasuring even. To the Shops, and even to us, this concept seems strange, but once you start to appreciate the beauty of several hours of mixing sounds together until they make sense, you too will find yourself utterly amused by these deceivingly obscure songs. Likewise, shop music has been called big band or lounge jazz by other fans, and I can understand why. Those were the music of the 1920s, an era that the Shops are clearly inspired from. Those genres will be a perfect fit for the eternal bonanza that they are living in. But in reality, their music doesn't really sound a lot like that, and that's because shop culture isn't the lazy utopia we think it is. Their music tells a tale of a blend between cultures. The focus of the Shops has slowly shifted from leisure, and they have started to yearn for a more experimental sound. Some mole instruments appear on the latter shop tracks, being proof of the musical developments of shop cultures. Now, the emulator is not a perfect instrument. There was some charm to the old scenes from the 70s res that couldn't be replicated with it, at least not yet. Their former albums do sound more darkful and sinister, especially Mark of the Mole, and the emulator, even though it was an impressive advancement in music tech, it wasn't quite as complex as something like a synclavier. So, paradoxically, having a more powerful tool led to a more limited sound. The emulator didn't lend itself to a sound as weird or rough as the avant-garde crowd wanted, continuing the breakup between the band and their fame in the underground scene. And it sure as hell wasn't something the mainstream audiences wanted either. Not the way the Residents used the emulator at least. Even if, in many regards, Tunes is one of the most accessible Residents albums. I understand Tunes of the Cities is not big. Barely any vocals, very limited MIDI-esque sound. It's definitely something you have to get used to. But once you do, I understand the mentality of each civilization and how they pour it into the tracks, how their lifestyles are, and the way these songs express those lifestyles. You too will see that these are some of Hardy Fox's best work, not only musically, but conceptually, an ingenious documentary of two contrasting cultures.
The Mole Show hit the Residents like it was a fucking truck. The show had clearly been designed to tour exactly one state for 1 week, and so featured 20 huge backdrops, 20 members of personnel, and countless props. As a week-long tour of one state, the Mole Show was viable and even profitable.
And LA, as I said, was extremely successful. There was talk of more major recording contract, and that never materialized, and I don't have the information as to what side it didn't materialize on.
But as the Residents were pushed into a month-long tour of Europe, it became impossible to profit off. This prompted the departure of John Kennedy, who took with him the Residents' large recording studio. Actually touring the show was just blunder after blunder, and Ralph Records was left nearly penniless, almost bankrupt, and in a much smaller studio space than they had been used to. During the final week of the tour, the Residents played in London, where they met with their good friends and fellow Ralph artists, Ronaldo and the Loaf. Ronaldo, the Loaf, and the Residents had worked together some years earlier on a collaborative album during the sessions for Mark of the Mole. But after just 4 days, the material was shelved and the groups both went back to work on their individual projects. But now, needing a distraction from the traumatic tour they had just been on, the Residents and Ronaldo began work on finishing the material. The Loaf, who was unable to attend, provided the group with some tape loops he had created for use in the sessions. Title in Limbo was something of a step backwards for the Residents' so-called emulator era. The equipment they had been touring with, including the emulators, was still in storage in London. Neither the Residents or Ralph were able to afford the storage fees, and so the items were held. Title in Limbo was released in November of 1983, and whilst it wasn't as popular as Tunes of Two Cities, it still generated enough cash flow to keep Ralph afloat. Title in Limbo is a tragically overlooked album. It's like an album from an alternative timeline, showcasing what the Residents could have been if they had decided to take the commercial album sound somewhere else. And that makes a lot of sense, considering the timeline in which this album was recorded. But by being released after what many fans consider the classic era, many Cliffords choose to simply ignore the album, doing a great disservice to a record that easily fits within the group's earlier output. Instead of developing the commercial album sound into the sprawling suites of Mark of the Mole, the Residents instead developed the sound of the commercial album into more conventionally length but still odd tracks. The album even features the same diversity of voice cast as the commercial album did, with 3 separate lead vocalists found throughout the album. The album is catchy, fun, and weird, sonically diverse, and yet still sounding of one whole. The album sounds neither like the Residents nor Ronaldo and the Loaf, but like a love child of the two, containing recognizable elements of both groups, but still having its own identity. Whilst the album doesn't have any overarching concept beyond being a collaboration, it still has unique and identifiable themes, such as the feeling of inadequacy present throughout each track. This is perhaps due to the feeling of rejection they were having through the tour, or maybe it was something else going on in their private lives, we'll never know. But it works and it connects. In many ways, this is the Residents' most human feeling album. But most of all, it's just fun. And that's all there really is to say on the matter.
Title in Limbo is my favorite studio work of not only the Residents, but of Ronaldo and the Loaf as well. It perfectly mixes the techniques and cadences of both groups, while also providing twists on their respective styles. On top of the powerhouse that is each of these groups together, Stickfinger's iconic melodical tapestry of both harmony and freshness is on full display throughout the album, especially in songs like Sitting in the Sand and the closing track of the album. He serves to both elevate and reinforce the seamless meaning of melody and lyric that is constantly on full display throughout the album. The lyrics also epitomize the ingenious way that the Residents can write stories that sound epic and grand in scope, while in actuality, they only contain a few mundane passages, such as in Monkey and Bunny, wherein barely any actual events are described, and yet it still feels like a highly layered and intricate story while you're listening to it. Other tracks have served to become classics among the Residents' fan base, such as Mahogany Wood and The Shoe Salesman, because of their fun cadences, simple yet pleasing melodies, and distinctive atmosphere that they provide. Distinct atmosphere is really what permeates the entire album, and it's what ultimately sets it far above the rest of either group's studio output. Even when the songs are taken as individual tracks, they are all perfectly succinct and yet highly developed upon. There's a reason Monkey and Bunny and Mahogany Wood have appeared on nearly every major Residents compilation, and yet there's no reason that the other tracks from Title and Limbo have not.
So that's the history of the Residents' early years. From the gestational period of 1969 to 1973, to the peak of their popularity in the late 1970s, to the gamble that tried, but failed, to kill them. This video covers about 20% of the Residents' career, and there's so much more ahead of this that is amazing and engaging to listen to. The 1980s brings a new maturity to the Residents' songwriting, as well as a visually stunning, yet camp and minimalist approach to live shows. The 1990s sees the Residents expand into the world of multimedia, producing comic books and video games featuring engaging and tragic characters. The 2000s sees the Residents take their sound into a more dark area, inspired by a sonic rearrangement that twists the traditional 4-piece band format. The 2010s sees the Residents perfect their approach to live performance and become comfortable with it for the first time ever. From 2010 onwards, they have performed live every year, which is something that was a complete rarity beforehand. They also began playing with the internet, creating blogs and vlogs which take their twisted sensibilities and characters into the modern age. The 2020s have seen the Residents expand into film, with their feature-length debut Triple Trouble, released in 2022, and the Mary Louisier film Behind the Mask, currently in production. There are also, of course, a number of rumored scripts, which we know little about. The Residents, as a concept, are a celebration of all things odd. The Residents are a warm embrace to anyone who feels like they're on the outskirts of the mainstream. And their explorations of identity are poignant and welcome. They're exploring the very limits of what music, art, and technology can be, and most importantly, enjoying themselves whilst doing it. The Residents approach every project they start from a level of complete amateurity, and they never produce anything that is of industry quality. And that's what makes them so inspiring to any creative. Before I was into the Residents, David Bowie was my hero. But back then, any music I would make would be a parody of any missteps that I thought they made. And what I meant by missteps was just slightly unconventional tracks that they produced. And this obviously came from a position of self-consciousness. I thought, well, I can't produce anything like the good stuff that these artists produce, but I can create a sort of parody of the bad stuff they produce, using my very little knowledge of anything. I didn't even think it was possible for me to learn any actual songwriting skills. And that was until I heard the Residents. They were amateurish. They were making music not at the same level as me, but at a level I could easily grab. And it made me realize that I could learn how to make music like they were making music. And then I could learn how to make other music. And it basically was the key to my inspiration behind being creative at all. It's this idea that what you make doesn't have to be perfect, because if it's imperfect, someone will like that. And you can later make it perfect as you go on and develop your style. But what's important is that you own it, and this is what the Residents did their whole career. They owned it. So that's basically where this video is gonna end. Spoiler alert, but the Residents survive and they continue making music to this very day. They just finished their 50th anniversary tour, just announced their 51st, and in 2022 released what is by my count their 46th studio album, all the while promoting a new film and a new album, Dr. Dark. Think about how incomprehensibly large a discography that is. Only Cliff Richards has achieved that many albums, and he had a 10-year start on them. If you want to learn more about the Residents, I highly recommend you check out Ian Shirley's book, Never Known Questions, published on the group's 40th anniversary. Out of all of the books I read for this video, Never Known Questions seems to be the most fun read. Although you might want to keep in mind that it is 8 years old at this point, so for a more in-depth and updated read, you might want to seek out the Faceless Forever encyclopedia that was published last year. The Residents' golden age, the period that this video covers, is certainly a period during which an amazing body of work was produced. And even though certain Cliffords will tell you that the Residents were never the same after this, I think that that's true, but not a bad thing. The Residents, even during this period, were constantly shifting. This just proves how diverse their sound is. If you don't like one album, that doesn't mean you won't like any of them. Their sound is that diverse where there's definitely something in there that you will like if you do enough digging. You might think that I'm stopping the video here because, oh, the next 40 years of their career just aren't worth talking about, but that's simply not true. Look at the timeline. Look at how long this video is right now. You don't want that to be times 5, do you? That's how long it would take me to even briefly discuss the rest of their career. So, get off my back. Okay?